Hey everyone, just a quick review on intervals. So, as we've talked about in class and also in the book, um, we start with looking at the intervals 1, 4, 5, and 8, unison, fourth, fifth, and octave, because these are the perfect, we call them perfect intervals. And in general, when we're trying to determine the interval size and quality, there are different parts of the process that's necessary. So a quick review here for interval size, we're counting from the bottom pitch to the top pitch using the musical alphabet. So for example, let's say I have two notes here, F and A, and F and A. It's a third because we start with the bottom note, we count up to the top note through the musical alphabet, F, G, and A. So F, G, A, that's a third. And in order for us to figure out whether it's a major, minor, or perfect, diminished, or augmented interval, that's the quality, okay? Okay, going back to a fifth and a fourth and all of that, because we're starting with 1, 4, 5, and 8. I'm going to make this a fifth, okay, F to C. Okay, so this is a fifth, F, G, A, B, C. There are 5 letters in between these notes, including the bottom one. Next, I'm going to look at whether or not the top note is found in a major scale starting with the bottom note. So a sentence you can ask yourself is, for example, we'll go like this: is C part of the F major scale? Right? Is C part of the F major scale? And I know from studying the key signatures, I know that there's one flat in F, and it's B flat. So then C, of course, is part of the F major scale. There's no, it's not flatted or sharped. So if that's true, then if it's a fifth, it's a perfect fifth. Okay. So and if this is also true, and if it's a fourth, then it's a perfect fourth. If the top note is found in the major scale built on the bottom note, and if the size of it is 1, 4, 5, or 8, unison, fourth, fifth, or octave, then these intervals are perfect. Okay. For and the same idea for intervals 2, 3, 6, and 7, the second, the third, the sixth, and the seventh, if the top note is also part of the major scales built on the bottom note, then these intervals are major. Right? So here's an example. I'm going to do this: A and C sharp. First, the size of this is a third, because we count from A, B to C. Those are the 3 letters, so it's a third. Next, I'm looking at whether the top note is part of the major scale built on the bottom note. So is C sharp part of the major scale built on A? So essentially, is C sharp part of A major? And of course it is. In part of A major's key signature, C sharp's a part of that, so this interval is a major third. Right? If you don't have that, let's say I have, let's go back to our 5th example here. Okay, so F and C. Let's say I have something like this. Okay, so I have F and C sharp. I know it's a fifth, but I know that C sharp is definitely not part of the F major scale. Next, you have to figure out, okay, what is? Well, I know that C is part of the F major scale, so I know that F to C is a perfect fifth. But that's not what we had in the question. We had this, C sharp. If it's a half step larger than the perfect interval, then that's an augmented. So this is an augmented fifth. If it's a half step smaller, let's say I had this instead, F to C flat, then this is a diminished interval. So this is a diminished fifth. Right? Careful here, the way that we talk about whether or not an interval is an augmented fourth versus a diminished fifth, for example, even though both have the same number of half steps, really has to do with how the notes are spelled on the page. What are the note names? Okay, if it's from some kind of F to some kind of C, we have to describe this as a fifth. It can't be a fourth, even though it might have enharmonic notes using different sharps and flats. Okay. Okay, so 2 more things here, 2 more tips. And sorry, for the major intervals, of course, if we start with a major interval, F and A here, if it's a half step smaller than that, then that becomes a minor interval. So this is a minor third. This is also a minor third, F sharp to A. If it's another half step smaller than that, okay, it becomes a diminished interval. So you can call this a diminished third. Right? And then if let's go back to major here. So this is our major interval f to a. If it's a half step larger, let's say we do that, then that becomes an augmented third, right? And we can also stretch this interval, this major interval, by lowering the bottom note as well. So we have f flat to a, okay? That's also an augmented third, okay? Okay, two more methods here about trying to figure out what the intervals are. So if you have something like this, f flat to b flat, and you're trying to figure out what interval this is, okay, and you don't know what f flat major is. You don't know whether or not b flat is part of the f flat major scale, because that was difficult. Okay, so there's another way of doing this. If you're encountering this and you're not sure, you can try inverting the interval. Okay, so you can invert this by putting one of those notes an octave higher or lower, depending on which one it is. So if it's a lower note, put an octave higher. If it's the higher note, put an octave lower. So in this case, I can do this by, let's see if I transpose this note up an octave, and now I have F flat and B flat. Okay, and I know that F flat is definitely not part of the B flat major scale. F is. Okay, so I'm evaluating this interval now, and so I know that B flat to F is a major. Sorry, it's a perfect fifth. Right, but that's not what I have. I have an F flat, so it's 1/2 step smaller. So this is a diminished fifth. Right. Okay, so what do you do with the summation? Well, it's useful because I know that fourths always inverts to fifths. Perfect intervals always invert to perfect intervals, and augmented intervals always invert to diminished, and diminished always invert to augmented. Okay, and this information is on page 73 if you want to review. So by knowing that this inverted interval is in fact a diminished fifth, I know that if I invert it back to where it was, F flat to B flat, this has to be an augmented fourth. Right? So that's one more way. And another way you can look at this is that if there are two notes with the same flat or sharp next to it, so I have two notes, they're both flatted or sharped, you can also just disregard the flats and just look at the notes and see whether or not what kind of interval that is, because you're essentially the sharps and flats, if they both have the same one, they're just moving all the notes down a half step or up a half step. Okay, but mathematically it still has the same content of half steps. Okay, so for example, I can just imagine this as trying to figure out what is the interval between F and B natural, and that's an augmented fourth. So by default, an F flat to B flat will also be an augmented fourth. Right? Finally, if all else fails, you can also try to remember the half steps that are the number of half steps that are in each kind of interval, and there's a chart of them on page 79 for your reference. Just be careful that in the instance for augmented fourth and diminished fifth, both of those have 6 half steps. Okay, and as we mentioned before, the way we talk about these intervals is really by the way that it looks on the page. If it's a fourth, if it's written as a fourth, it has to be a fourth. If it's written as fifth, it has to be described as a fifth. Okay, great. I hope you can improve on your chords here. I know they'll be very useful not only for this class and also for your musicianship in the future. And I think musician, the program is going to help. So keep at it, and let me know if you have any questions.